The video went viral in less than 3 hours. 17 million views. 40,000 comments. And a nation watching in horror as a 24-year-old man in a designer suit shoved an 81-year-old war veteran to the ground outside a Providence grocery store. All because the elderly man's shopping cart had accidentally bumped his luxury sedan. "Do you know who my father is?" the young man screamed in the footage, his face twisted with rage. "I will destroy you, old man." The veteran's name was Harold Eugene Mitchell. Sergeant First Class, United States Army, retired. 3 tours in Vietnam. 2 Purple Hearts. 53 years of marriage to his beloved wife, Dorothy, who had passed away just 8 months before the assault. Harold had survived bullets, mortar fire, and the jungles of Southeast Asia, only to be attacked in the parking lot of his neighborhood grocery store by a boy young enough to be his grandson. The security camera captured everything. It captured the moment 24-year-old Bradley Raymond Mercer stepped out of his silver Porsche, his face already contorted with entitlement. It captured Harold raising his hands in a peaceful gesture, clearly trying to apologize for the minor scratch on the vehicle's door. It captured Bradley grabbing the old man by his worn Army veteran jacket and throwing him against the pavement with such force that Harold's head bounced off the concrete. And it captured something else, something that made the nation's blood boil. Bradley Mercer stood over the bleeding veteran, pulled out his phone, and took a selfie. He was smiling. The injuries were severe. Harold Mitchell suffered a fractured hip, a broken wrist, and a traumatic brain injury that would require 3 surgeries and months of rehabilitation. At 81 years old, the doctors weren't sure he would ever walk again without assistance. But Harold Mitchell was not just any elderly man. He was the founder of the Mitchell Veterans Foundation, an organization that had helped over 12,000 homeless veterans find housing, employment, and dignity over the past 30 years. He had been named Providence's Citizen of the Year 4 times. He had personally mentored hundreds of troubled youth, teaching them discipline, respect, and honor. Every Thanksgiving for the past 4 decades, Harold had served meals at the local shelter, standing for hours despite his aging knees, because he believed that service to others was the highest calling a person could answer. When word spread about what had happened to him, the city erupted. Thousands gathered outside the hospital where Harold was fighting for his life. Candles were lit. Prayers were offered. American flags waved in the cold November wind. Veterans in their old uniforms stood in silent vigil, some of them weeping openly for their fallen brother. "This man gave everything for this country," said retired Colonel James Patterson, his voice breaking as he addressed the crowd. "And some privileged punk nearly killed him over a scratch on a car. Where is the justice? Where is the accountability?" The pressure mounted on the district attorney's office. Calls flooded in from across the nation. Senators issued statements. News anchors demanded answers. The hashtag Justice for Harold trended worldwide for 6 consecutive days. Bradley Mercer was arrested, but he was released on bail within hours, a bail so high that it would have been impossible for any ordinary citizen to pay, but merely an inconvenience for someone of his family's wealth. And that's when the second wave of outrage began. Because Bradley Mercer wasn't just any arrogant young man. He was the son of Chief Raymond Mercer, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the state. A man whose power and influence extended into every corner of the justice system. A man who had built his entire career on the promise of law and order, and whose son had just demonstrated a complete contempt for both. Rumors swirled that strings were being pulled, that witnesses were being pressured, that the case would quietly disappear into the bureaucratic maze of continuances and plea deals that so often protected the privileged from consequences. But then something unexpected happened. The case was assigned to Judge Francis Caprio. Judge Caprio was a legend in Providence. 73 years old, with over 4 decades on the bench, he was known throughout the legal community as a man who could not be bought, intimidated, or swayed. His courtroom was famous for its humanity. He had gone viral himself numerous times for his compassionate treatment of struggling single mothers, first-time offenders, and people who had simply made mistakes. But he was equally famous for his absolute intolerance of arrogance, entitlement, and disrespect for the law. Defense attorneys immediately filed for a change of venue. They argued that Judge Caprio couldn't possibly be impartial given the media attention. They claimed their client couldn't receive a fair trial. They demanded that the case be moved to another jurisdiction, another judge, another courtroom where the weight of public opinion wouldn't press so heavily on the scales of justice. Judge Caprio denied every motion. The legal establishment was stunned. A coalition of high-powered defense attorneys, some of the most expensive lawyers in the state, publicly united against him, filing formal complaints and demanding his recusal. They gave interviews on cable news, warning that Judge Caprio was allowing emotion to override jurisprudence, that he was turning the courtroom into a circus, that he was denying their client his constitutional rights. Judge Caprio remained unmoved. "This case will be heard in my courtroom," he said in his written ruling, "and justice will be served according to the law, not according to the defendant's last name, his father's position, or the size of his legal team. If the attorneys have a problem with that, they are welcome to file an appeal." After the trial, the city held its breath. The nation watched. And on a gray Monday morning, the trial of Bradley Raymond Mercer began in courtroom number 3 of the Providence Municipal Court. But an unexpected revelation was about to change everything in the courtroom. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Every seat was taken. People stood 3 deep along the walls. Deputies had to turn away hundreds who had arrived hoping to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the decade. Outside, a crowd had gathered that would grow throughout the day. Veterans in their uniforms, community members holding signs, journalists from every major network jostling for position. Inside, the air was thick with tension, anticipation, and barely contained fury. Judge Francis Caprio entered precisely at 9 o'clock. His black robe seemed to absorb the light, and his silver hair framed a face that had seen everything the human condition had to offer: tragedy and triumph, cruelty and compassion, lies and truth. He moved slowly, deliberately, as a man does when he carries the weight of justice on his shoulders and has learned not to rush its delivery. "All rise," the bailiff called, though most were already standing. Judge Caprio took his seat and surveyed the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. He noted the packed gallery. He noted the rows of reporters. He noted the American flag that stood beside him, and perhaps he thought of all it represented, all the men and women who had fought and bled and died for the principles that flag embodied. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice quiet but somehow filling every corner of the room. "The people versus Bradley Raymond Mercer. Before we proceed, I want to make something clear." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "This is a court of law, not a court of public opinion, not a court of social media. Every person in this room, including the defendant, will be treated with the respect that the law demands. But I expect the same respect in return. For this court. For the victim. For the truth. Anyone who cannot meet that expectation will be removed. Do I make myself understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the gallery. The defendant was brought in through a side door. Bradley Mercer had clearly been coached by his legal team on how to present himself. Gone was the designer suit from the viral video. In its place, he wore a modest navy blazer over a white shirt, an attempt to appear humble, relatable, ordinary. His hair had been cut shorter, more conservative. His expression had been arranged into something meant to resemble remorse. But his eyes betrayed him. There was something in those eyes that the expensive suit couldn't hide, that the haircut couldn't disguise, that no amount of legal coaching could extinguish. It was the look of a young man who had never been told no, who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of, who believed, even now, that this was all a performance, an inconvenient theater that would eventually end with him walking free. He scanned the courtroom with barely concealed disdain, as if the crowd gathered to witness his judgment were insects beneath his notice. When his gaze fell on the section where Harold Mitchell's supporters sat, many of them elderly veterans wearing their medals, his lip curled almost imperceptibly. Judge Caprio saw it. He saw everything. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, "do you understand the charges against you?" Bradley's lead attorney, a silver-tongued litigator named Vincent Cole who charged $800 an hour, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client—" "I asked Mr. Mercer," Judge Caprio interrupted, his tone unchanged but somehow sharper. "Not you, counselor." A flush crept up Vincent Cole's neck. He sat down. Bradley cleared his throat, clearly annoyed at being addressed directly. "Yeah," he said. "I understand." "You will address this court as Your Honor," Judge Caprio said. "And you will answer with complete sentences." "Try again." The courtroom was utterly silent. Bradley's jaw tightened. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I understand the charges." "Good. Then we may proceed." The prosecution's case was devastating. Witness after witness took the stand to describe what they had seen that November afternoon. The security footage was played in its entirety, the courtroom forced to watch Harold Mitchell's frail body strike the concrete, forced to see Bradley Mercer's triumphant smile as he stood over his victim. Medical experts testified to the extent of Harold's injuries, the fractures, the brain trauma, the months of surgery and rehabilitation, the permanent damage that would affect him for whatever remained of his life. Character witnesses spoke of Bradley Mercer's pattern of behavior, the prior incidents that had been quietly settled, the complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, the trail of intimidation and entitlement that had followed him like a shadow. Throughout it all, Bradley maintained his expression of bored tolerance, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, sometimes checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. And then Harold Mitchell was called to the stand. He entered the courtroom in a wheelchair. A gasp went through the gallery. Many had not seen him since before the assault, when he had walked tall and straight despite his 81 years, when his eyes had sparkled with the joy of a man who had found purpose in service to others. Now his face was pale, drawn. His left arm was still in a cast. A visible scar ran along his temple where the surgeons had operated to relieve the pressure on his brain. But his eyes still held something unbroken. Deputy after deputy stepped forward to help him, but Harold waved them away. With agonizing slowness, using his one good arm, he pushed himself out of the wheelchair and stood. His legs trembled. His breathing was labored. But he stood. The courtroom rose with him, not because the bailiff commanded it, but because they could not remain seated in the presence of such dignity. Judge Caprio's eyes glistened, though his face remained impassive. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said gently, "you may remain seated if you prefer." "With respect, Your Honor," Harold replied, his voice thin but steady, "I stood at attention for my country for 30 years. I can stand for the truth." The silence that followed was sacred. Harold's testimony was simple and devastating. He described the day of the attack, how he had been shopping for groceries to bring to a widow in his neighborhood, how his cart had accidentally bumped the silver car, how he had immediately tried to apologize. "I said I was sorry," Harold recalled, his voice never rising, never breaking. "I offered to pay for any damage. I told him it was an accident. I called him son." "And what was the defendant's response?" the prosecutor asked. Harold was quiet for a moment. "He told me I was nothing. He told me my life didn't matter. He told me I was going to learn what happened to people who touched his things. And then he threw me to the ground. And the world went dark." The defense's cross-examination was a disaster. Vincent Cole, the $800 an hour attorney, tried to suggest that Harold had been aggressive, that he had initiated physical contact, that Bradley had acted in self-defense. The security footage was replayed, frame by frame, exposing every lie. Cole tried to question Harold's memory, suggesting that his brain injury made him an unreliable witness. Harold calmly recited his service number, his unit assignments, the names of the men he had served with, and the exact time and location of every incident he described. Cole tried to minimize the injuries, suggesting Harold's age made him fragile, that any minor contact could have caused such damage, that Bradley couldn't have known how vulnerable his victim was. "Counselor," Harold said, looking directly at Bradley Mercer for the first time, "a 24-year-old man threw an 81-year-old to the concrete. He didn't need to know how fragile I was. He needed to know how to be a decent human being. And he didn't." Bradley Mercer made his final mistake then. He laughed. It was quiet, barely more than a snort, but in the silence of that courtroom it rang like a gunshot. Every head turned. Every eye fixed on him. Judge Caprio's gaze could have cut through steel. "Something amusing, Mr. Mercer?" the judge asked, his voice dangerously soft. Bradley's attorneys tried to intervene, but it was too late. Something in Bradley snapped. Perhaps the pressure, perhaps the indignity of being questioned, perhaps the simple inability of a spoiled child to tolerate a moment longer of accountability. "This is ridiculous," Bradley said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's just some old man. Do you know how much that car cost? It's worth more than everything he owns. Everything all these people own." He gestured dismissively at the gallery. "My father is the chief of police. This whole thing is going to go away, and everyone knows it. So can we just skip to the part where you find me and I go home?" The courtroom erupted. Deputies moved to restore order. Judge Caprio's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order!" the judge commanded. "Order!" Slowly, painfully, silence returned. Judge Caprio stared at Bradley Mercer with an expression that made several people in the gallery involuntarily step backward. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, "you have just demonstrated more clearly than any witness, any evidence, or any argument ever could exactly who you are and what you believe. You believe your father's position makes you untouchable. You believe your money makes you superior. You believe this court, this victim, and everyone in this room exists beneath you." He leaned forward. "You are about to learn how wrong you are." And then someone stood up in the back of the courtroom. Every head turned toward the back of the room. A man was rising from his seat in the last row, a seat partially hidden behind a pillar, where someone might sit if they didn't want to be noticed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair cropped close to his skull and a face that bore the marks of a lifetime in law enforcement. He wore civilian clothes, a simple dark suit, but there was no hiding the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Chief Raymond Mercer stepped into the aisle. The murmur that went through the courtroom was like the rumble of distant thunder. Deputies tensed. Attorneys froze. Reporters scrambled for their phones. In the defendant's chair, Bradley's face went white as chalk. "Dad?" he said, his voice suddenly small. "What are you? Why are you?" Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence. His eyes met Chief Mercer's across the length of the courtroom. Two men who had known each other for decades, who had worked on opposite sides of the same justice system, who understood better than anyone the weight of the moment that was unfolding. "Chief Mercer," Judge Caprio said, "this is unexpected." Raymond Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, passing through the gallery like Moses through the Red Sea. The crowd parted before him, not out of respect, not any more, but out of something closer to shock. "Your Honor," the chief said, his voice rough, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him, "I ask the court's permission to speak." The defense attorneys were on their feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The chief is not a witness, not a party to these proceedings." "I am the defendant's father," Raymond Mercer said, still looking at the judge. "And there are things that need to be said. Things that should have been said a long time ago." Judge Caprio was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "The court will hear you, Chief Mercer. Approach." Bradley was shaking now. "Dad, what are you doing? Tell them to stop this. Tell them who I am. You promised you would." "Be quiet, Bradley." The chief's voice cracked like a whip, and his son fell silent as if struck. Raymond Mercer walked past the defense table without looking at his son. He walked past the prosecution, past the witness stand where Harold Mitchell still sat watching with quiet, unreadable eyes. He stopped directly before the judge's bench, standing at attention like the young officer he had once been. "Your Honor," he began, and his voice was steady even as something in his eyes seemed to break, "I have spent 35 years in law enforcement. I have dedicated my life to justice, to protecting the innocent, to holding the guilty accountable. I have sent men to prison. I have taken badges from corrupt officers. I have looked into the eyes of killers and told them they would pay for what they had done." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And I have failed completely in the one place it mattered most. My own home." The courtroom had become a vacuum, silent and breathless. "I see my son sitting there," the chief continued, "and I see everything I did wrong. Every time I made an excuse for his behavior. Every time I used my position to make his problems disappear. Every time I told myself he was just young, just reckless, just needed time to grow up." He turned, finally, to look at Bradley. The young man's face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "I told myself I was protecting you," Raymond said to his son. "I told myself that's what fathers do. But I wasn't protecting you, Bradley. I was destroying you. Every time I shielded you from the consequences of your actions, I taught you that actions don't have consequences. Every time I pulled strings to make your mistakes go away, I taught you that the rules don't apply to you. Every time I chose to see you as my son instead of as the man you were becoming, I failed you in the most fundamental way a father can fail." Tears were streaming down his face now, but his voice held steady. "I look at that man," he said, pointing to Harold Mitchell, "and I see everything my son should have become. Honor, dignity, service, sacrifice. Mr. Mitchell gave his youth, his health, his very life to this country, and my son threw him to the ground over a scratch on a car." He turned back to Judge Caprio. "Your Honor, I know what people expect. They expect me to use my influence, my connections, my position to protect my son from justice. They expect me to call in favors, to threaten careers, to make this all go away the way I've made so many things go away before." The chief's jaw tightened. "I will not do that." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. "I am here today not as the chief of police, but as a father who has finally understood that love without accountability is not love at all, it is destruction. I am here to tell this court that I will not interfere with these proceedings. I will not attempt to influence the outcome. I will not use my position in any way to help my son escape the consequences of what he has done." He stepped back, straightening to his full height. "I ask this court to judge my son according to the law. Apply it fully. Apply it fairly. Whatever sentence you deem appropriate, I will not challenge it. I will not appeal it. Because the greatest gift I can give my son now, the only gift I have left to give, is to let him finally face the truth of who he has become." Bradley Mercer broke. The young man who had swaggered into the courtroom with contempt in his eyes, who had laughed at his victim's testimony, who had boasted that his father's position made him untouchable, that young man crumbled like a sandcastle before a wave. "Dad," he sobbed, the word torn from him like a confession. "Dad, please, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please don't leave me. Please." Raymond Mercer walked to his son. For a moment he stood there, looking down at the weeping young man who had once been a laughing little boy in his arms. Then, slowly, He knelt beside the defendant's chair. "I'm not leaving you, son," he said softly. "I'm finally loving you the right way. I'm finally being the father I should have been all along." He took Bradley's face in his hands. "You did a terrible thing. You hurt an innocent man. You need to face that. You need to own it. And when you've paid your debt, when you've really, truly understood what you did, I will be there. I will help you become the man I should have raised you to be. But I cannot help you escape who you are. Not any more." Father and son looked at each other, and something passed between them. Something broken, something painful, but also something that might, in time, become the foundation of something new. Judge Caprio allowed the moment to breathe. Then he spoke. "Chief Mercer, this court acknowledges your statement. It will be taken into consideration. You may return to your seat." The chief rose, squeezed his son's shoulder once, and walked back up the aisle. He did not look back. Bradley Mercer sat in the defendant's chair, head bowed, shoulders shaking with sobs. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. In their place was something raw, something wounded, something that might, perhaps, have the capacity to heal. Judge Caprio let the silence stretch until it had done its work. "We will now proceed to sentencing," he said. Judge Francis Caprio looked out over his courtroom. He had presided over thousands of cases in his long career. He had seen the best and worst of humanity pass before his bench. He had learned that justice was not simply about punishment, it was about transformation, about accountability, about creating the conditions in which broken people might have the chance to become whole. He had also learned that some moments carried more weight than others, that some sentences would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom, touching lives he would never see, changing hearts he would never know. This was such a moment. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, "please rise." Bradley stood on trembling legs. His face was swollen from crying. The arrogance was gone, but Judge Caprio had seen too many transformations that lasted only until the courtroom doors closed. The question was whether this breaking would lead to genuine rebuilding, or simply become another wound that calcified into bitterness. "Before I pronounce sentence," the judge continued, "I want you to understand something. The law does not exist to seek revenge. It does not exist to destroy those who break it. The law exists to protect society, yes, but also to offer those who have strayed a path back to righteousness. The sentence I am about to deliver is not designed to crush you. It is designed to forge you into something better, if you have the courage to let it." He paused, gathering himself. "On the charge of assault causing grievous bodily harm, I find you guilty. On the charge of criminal intimidation, I find you guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment of an elderly person, I find you guilty." Each word fell like a stone. The sentence of this court is as follows. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in the state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after 3 years contingent upon demonstrated rehabilitation and good behavior. Bradley swayed but remained standing. "Additionally," Judge Caprio continued, "upon your release, you will complete 1,000 hours of community service, specifically, service at the Mitchell Veterans Foundation, working directly with the homeless veterans that Mr. Mitchell has dedicated his life to helping. You will see, firsthand, what sacrifice looks like, what service looks like, what honor looks like. Furthermore, you will attend mandatory counseling sessions focused on empathy, anger management, and the responsibilities that come with privilege. You will write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Mitchell, to be read aloud in this courtroom before your service begins. Finally, and this is unusual, but this court believes it is necessary, before beginning your sentence, you will spend 1 week visiting veterans' hospitals, speaking with men and women who have served this country, hearing their stories, understanding what they have given so that people like you could live in freedom and safety." The judge looked at Bradley with something that was not quite severity and not quite compassion, something in between that might have been hope. "This sentence is harsh, Mr. Mercer. It is meant to be. But it is also an opportunity. What you make of it is entirely up to you. Before anyone could react, Chief Raymond Mercer stood once more. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, I would like to add something." Judge Caprio nodded. The chief walked forward again, and this time he stood beside his son, facing the court. "In addition to the sentence this court has imposed," Raymond Mercer said, "I am implementing consequences of my own. Bradley, effective immediately, you are removed from the family trust. You will not inherit the wealth you expected. You will start from nothing, like most people in this world, and you will learn what it means to earn something with your own hands." Bradley closed his eyes, but he did not protest. "Furthermore," the chief continued, "I am resigning from my position as chief of police." A wave of shock rolled through the courtroom. "I cannot, in good conscience, enforce the law while knowing that I have spent years helping my own son evade it. The department, this city, and the law itself deserve better. I will spend my remaining years doing what I should have been doing all along, teaching my son, by example, what it means to live with integrity." He turned to face Harold Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. My failures as a father nearly cost you your life. I cannot undo what my son did to you. But I give you my word, the word of a man who has finally remembered what honor means, that I will dedicate myself to ensuring that something good comes from this tragedy, that my son becomes someone who makes the world better instead of worse. It is the least I owe you." Harold Mitchell, still seated in his wheelchair, had been watching in silence. Now he raised his hand, and the courtroom grew still. "Your Honor," Harold said, "may I speak?" "Of course, Mr. Mitchell." Slowly, painfully, Harold once again pushed himself to his feet. Deputies rushed to help him, and this time he accepted their assistance, leaning on a cane as he faced the court. "I've been asked many times over these past months what I want," Harold said. "What justice would look like to me. What would make this right?" He looked at Bradley, not with hatred, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling to the young man, understanding. "I'm 81 years old. I've seen more than most people see in 3 lifetimes. I've held dying friends in foxholes. I've written letters to widows. I've watched good men destroyed by bitterness and bad men redeemed by grace. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: holding on to anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die." He took a shaky step toward Bradley. "Young man, you hurt me. You hurt me badly. You took things from me that I will never get back. Mobility, independence, months of my life I'll never recover. You did it because you thought you were better than me, because you thought the things you owned were more important than the man I am." Bradley couldn't meet his eyes. Tears dripped from his chin onto the courtroom floor. "But I am not going to hate you," Harold continued. "I am not going to spend whatever time I have left carrying you around in my heart like a stone. I forgive you, Bradley Mercer. Not because you deserve it. Not because what you did was acceptable. But because forgiveness is the only thing that will free both of us." He reached out and placed a trembling hand on Bradley's shoulder. "Your father is giving you a gift today. The judge is giving you a gift. And I am giving you a gift. We are giving you the chance to become someone worth being. Don't waste it. Don't you dare waste it." Bradley looked up, meeting Harold's eyes for the first time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know, son," Harold said. "I know. Now prove it. Not with words. With your life." Epilogue. 8 months later. The community center was filled with the smell of turkey and stuffing. Long tables stretched across the gymnasium, each one packed with men and women in worn clothes. Veterans who had fallen through the cracks of a society they had served, who had lost homes and families and hope, who had found their way to the Mitchell Veterans Foundation looking for a warm meal and maybe, just maybe, a reason to keep going. Working the serving line, wearing an apron and a hairnet, was a young man with close-cropped hair and calloused hands. Bradley Mercer had been released from prison 3 weeks earlier, having served 3 years of his 5-year sentence. The parole board had noted his exemplary behavior, his completion of every rehabilitation program offered, his genuine transformation from the arrogant young man who had entered the system to the humble one who was leaving it. He had started his community service immediately. "More mashed potatoes, sir?" Bradley asked the elderly man in front of him, a former Marine who had served in Desert Storm and had been living on the streets for the past 6 years. "Please," the man said, then squinted at Bradley's name tag. "Hey, aren't you that kid? The one who—" "Yes, sir," Bradley said quietly. "I am." The Marine studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Takes courage to be here," he said. "Takes courage to face the people you wronged." "It's the least I can do, sir." "It's a lot less than you did for all of us." The Marine smiled, a small smile, but real. "Mashed potatoes are good," he said, and moved on. At the end of the serving line, watching from his wheelchair, Harold Mitchell caught Bradley's eye and gave a small nod of approval. They had talked many times over the past months, first through the court-mandated visits, then through voluntary ones as Bradley began to genuinely seek Harold's guidance. The old veteran had become something Bradley had never expected, a mentor. Someone who had every reason to hate him but had chosen instead to help him become better. The relationship with his father was still healing. Raymond Mercer had kept his word. He had resigned, he had removed Bradley from the family trust, he had spent the past 3 years rebuilding himself as much as his son. They were learning to know each other again, not as enabler and entitled child, but as 2 men trying to figure out what integrity looked like. After the dinner service, when the last veteran had been fed and the dishes had been washed, Bradley stepped outside into the cool November air. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the stars, something he had learned to do in prison, when the night sky visible through his cell window had been his only reminder that there was a world beyond his failures. Harold rolled up beside him. "Thinking deep thoughts?" the old man asked. Bradley smiled slightly. "Just grateful, I guess. Grateful I got a second chance. Most people don't." "No, they don't." "So what are you going to do with it?" Bradley looked at the community center behind him, at the lights glowing through the windows where volunteers were still cleaning up, where men and women who had served their country were finding warmth and dignity and hope. "I want to do more of this," he said. "When my community service is done, I want to keep going. Maybe get trained as a counselor. Help other people who are as lost as I was find their way back." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he reached up and patted Bradley's arm. "I think," the old veteran said, "that your father would be proud. I think that I am proud. And more importantly, I think you should be proud of yourself." Bradley's eyes glistened. "I'm not there yet," he said. "But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying. That's all any of us can do, son. That's all any of us can do." They sat in comfortable silence, the old veteran and the young man who had once nearly killed him, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast indifferent sky, a sky that cared nothing for justice or redemption or second chances, but under which human beings had somehow learned to offer these gifts to one another anyway. In the end, that was what justice really meant. Not revenge, not punishment, but the chance to become better. The chance to transform. The chance to look at the worst thing you had ever done and say, "I will not let this define me. I will let it refine me." Bradley Mercer had learned this lesson the hard way. He had learned it in a courtroom where a judge refused to let him escape. In a prison cell where he had nothing but time to confront his failures. In a community center where the veterans he had once dismissed taught him what honor really looked like. He had learned it from a father who finally loved him enough to let him fall. He had learned it from a victim who had every right to hate him but chose forgiveness instead. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of what he had been given.